evening. I'm really excited to be here and chat with you all. So during my day job, I work at Environmental Advocates of New York, and my organization, we like to call ourselves New York State's Green Watchdog Organization, and we work on a lot of different environmental issues, and we make sure that our state government is making decisions that are the most protective of public health and the environment. And while that sounds nice and clean and simple, our jobs often are really messy and complicated. So as our water program director, I get to work on a lot of different issues that impact water, and the issue that has taken up a lot of my time, but has also been one of the most challenging and rewarding, has been working with the communities that have been recently impacted by water contamination crises. I imagine many people in this room are familiar with the story of Hoosick Falls, New York, which is not far from here at all. It's about a 40-minute drive. It's a beautiful little village that's on the border of Vermont. And almost 2 years ago marks the time when they got a letter from then EPA Region 2 Administrator Judith Enck, informing them that they shouldn't drink their water because it was polluted by a chemical known as PFOA. And it's a chemical that was widely used in Teflon products for many years. This chemical is associated with several different illnesses, many of which are quite severe. Preeclampsia, kidney disease, testicular cancer, heart disease, and more have been associated with increased exposure to PFOA. So, because of that crisis, I think that my organization, along with many New Yorkers and of course residents in Hoosick Falls, became keenly aware how much more the state needs to do to protect water quality. And the sad thing is, what happened in Hoosick Falls can and is happening elsewhere in the state and country, because PFOA is what we call an unregulated contaminant. And in the country, we have over 80,000 chemicals that are on the market and are unregulated. And many will argue it's because, we don't necessarily know the health impacts of these chemicals, but that's just not the case. There's many instances, PFOA being one of the great examples, where we are pretty keenly aware of what the health impacts are to exposure, but we still don't regulate them. And it's likely because it comes with an industry cost, and at the end of the day, I think many in this room already know the story. Whoever has the deeper pockets tend to win unless you organize. And so that's what I've been doing with impacted communities in New York State. In New York, we tend to be quite progressive on the environment, but we always are pushing for stronger leadership because, particularly in these times, I think many are aware, we have a really low bar on the federal level. So it's up to states like New York to really raise the bar for the rest of the country. So thanks to the residents in Hoosick Falls, we've actually seen significant changes to water policy in New York State. And it's because they mobilized, not just for their community, but they came in with a mission of making sure that what happened in Hoosick Falls doesn't continue to be the story elsewhere. Of course, we still have a long way to go, but I'm really excited to continue working with the residents of Hoosick Falls and changing the narrative on water in New York State, and working with residents in other impacted communities. Newburgh, New York, which is further away, it's about an hour south of here. They have PFOS, a related chemical in their water, and the source of their pollution is actually the Department of Defense from the National Air Guard base. So we have and for those that aren't aware, the Department of Defense is a renowned polluter globally. So they have a big fight ahead of them as well. So thankfully, the people in these communities are amazingly strong-willed and won't give up the fight. So I'm going to continue working with them. And in that spirit, I think it's time that I start talking about the person that this forum is in honor of, and that's James Connolly. James Connolly came to the United States in 1902 and moved to Troy in 1903, setting up house at 96 Ingalls Avenue, a few blocks from where this forum takes place. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. While he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel Delian, I'm probably pronouncing this badly, thank you, over the utility of fighting for wage increases, he was for this, and other questions. As most of you know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in great labor conflicts like the Dublin Lockout of 1913 and led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result. Today, he's recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century. So in this spirit, today we have Fred Magdoff. Fred Magdoff is Professor Emeritus of Plant and Soil Science at the University of Vermont and a longtime commentator on political economic topics. He is co-author with John Bellamy Foster of The Great Financial Crisis of 2009 and What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, both published by Monthly Review Press. The recent disasters created by Hurricane Irma and Maria make the urgency of response to climate change critical. Magdoff and his co-author Chris Williams have written a book that aims squarely at replacing capitalism with an ecologically sound and socially just society. Creating an ecological society is filled with revolutionary hope. So with that, I am pleased to have Fred Magdoff come and talk about his work.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks to the forum for inviting me. If I do get too far away from the microphone, please let me know, because I know my voice doesn't carry very well. Can everybody hear all right? Okay, I'll try to stay nearby, but I do have a tendency to wander, so yell or raise your hand or something. Copies of the book are available at half price. That's the price that I pay for them. They're over there for $10. There's also a copy which you can't have of this current issue of Monthly Review. It's my own copy, just for anyone who would like to see what a independent socialist magazine looks like. There are others, but this is one of the longest running ones. So what I'm going to do is try to give you an overview. It's an impossible task, but I will try to do the impossible, and we'll see how well I can pull it off. But to give you an overview of what the book is like, it is a book of 300 and some odd pages, in which we go into issues of ecology, politics, history of capitalism, imperialism, women's rights, racism, genetics, human nature, etc., etc. So we cover a wide variety of issues. And it is larger in that sense, as far as what it covers, than what our original ideas were, as to what we would do in the book. But as we got to topics, as we were discussing it and writing about it, things that we thought maybe could take a paragraph or two ended up being chapters, like about human nature, or about equality, for example. Those are individual chapters. And so that's sort of the book expanded. It's 12 chapters divided into 4 parts. And I just want to give you an idea of the 4 parts, and then I'll go into a discussion. The first part is why an alternative is essential. And what I'm talking about is an alternative to our current economic and political system, capitalism. And it goes into the severe social and ecological crises that exist around the world. So this is not just focused on the United States, although we do spend a lot of time talking about what we know best, which is the United States. But it certainly is meant to be of global interest. And we look at capitalism's role in creating these crises. Part 2 is an ecological society possible? And there have been objections saying, well, you can't really have a society that runs along ecological lines which is really egalitarian, where we really provide everyone with what we need, what each of us needs for our full development as a human being. Why? Because our human nature won't allow it, okay? Or we're just not equal anyway. You know, certain groups of people are just not as good or not as efficient or not as intellectually advanced as other groups. And therefore, what exists is really a reflection of that inequality of the genetics, and that is reflected in the inequality of economics. When we go into that issue, and I think pretty conclusively debunk that for anyone that might think along those lines. Then there's the question about, how do human beings fit in this in the environment as part of the ecosystem, not as above it and dominating it. The third part is what we can actually learn from nature and how nature operates, and how that can help us to organize our societies better, and how it can help us to organize what we do and how we make things better, how we produce food, how we produce other goods that we need for our livelihood. The last part is what a new society might look like, one that really operates along egalitarian lines and along ecologically sound lines, keeps all of the systems functioning, and then there's a discussion about how we get there, which of course is as great an issue as any of the others, if not greater. And Chris and I, we do not consider this to be a blueprint. We don't consider this to be anything more than our ideas, putting them forward for discussion purposes. This is not the last word, definitely, on any of these subjects of what a society might be like, how it might be organized, and how we're going to get there. We need a lot of people working together and thinking about it and talking about it in order to get there. Well, how bad is the situation now? It ain't good if you are not paying attention. Last year was the warmest year on record, which only beat the year before that, which only beat the year before that. This year is going to be not probably a record year, but it's going to be one of the warmest on record. The temperature now is 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit higher than it was at the beginning of the industrial age, and it is at a level that was last seen 100,000 years ago. So if we stopped production and use of all fossil fuels right now, we'd already be locked into another 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. And that's enough to do substantial damage as far as just the warming itself, and then what the warming has to do with regard to climate change. Climate change, by the way, today of all days, of all ministrations, there was released a report, which it had to release by law, which is the 4th National Climate Assessment, which is released today, which can be downloaded from, I found it through the Washington Post, but I'm sure you could find it through the U.S. government website or any of the discussions of it in the newspapers online. But it is basically comes out, I just read sort of the executive summary quickly because I just found it this afternoon, but basically says, yes, this is dramatic, it's doing severe damage right now, and yes, human beings are the ones that are causing this, and people are being harmed as we read this, as we speak tonight. There's a new study that says climate change will create the world's biggest refugee crisis in the world. The global warming has already resulted in numerous deaths because of heat waves, especially in parts of Asia and the Middle East. This is just the warming itself. This is separate from the shifting climate and the more intense rainfalls, the more intense storms that are occurring with greater frequency. What were once 500-year storms, that is, they occur on the average once every 500 years, are now occurring once every 50 years or maybe 10 years. So these are becoming much more frequent, the more intense storms, doing significant damage, and the glaciers are melting, the sea levels are rising. The only one that takes that seriously in the U.S. government, by the way, and on the federal level, on the local level, there are others who take it seriously, like Miami Beach, take it seriously because they're flooded regularly. The national level, the only branch of government that takes it seriously is the Defense Department. And that's because they have to deal with it. Norfolk, a naval base, is the largest naval base in the world. And it is flooding. And they had to get new piers built in order to accommodate the higher level of the sea. And the fellow who was in charge of this said we could not tell Congress why we wanted the piers built. Because if we said that the sea was rising and we needed these piers to adjust to the global sea rise, they wouldn't have given us the money to do it. So they just said, well, we just need new piers. So they got the money. We also have issues of species extinction, depletion of renewable resources like fish in the ocean, like water from aquifers that are being pumped quicker than they're being replenished. And then we have also tremendous amounts of pollution of the air and the water and the soil and the food that you eat, the products that you come in contact with, a little bit along the lines of what Liz was talking about. We are contaminated, as are many other organisms, with a variety of chemicals. The President's Council on the Environment, on cancer, said that we are born pre-polluted. In other words, babies are getting pollution through the umbilical cord from their mothers. We're polluted with plasticizers, stuff that's used to make plastic, and breakdown products, flame retardants. If you've got foam at home, chances are there's flame retardants in that. Pesticides, PFOA, which Liz mentioned was on my list of things that we are contaminated with, and we're talking about everybody. And it's hard to avoid these. There's a widespread contamination. It has been estimated, this is within the last 2 weeks, a report by the British medical journal, The Lancet, came out with a report that said 1/6 of the deaths that occur every year, that's 9 million people on a global basis, are a result of pollution. A good percentage of that is air pollution, but it's also chemical pollution of the water and the soil and the food and us. And so this is not a trivial issue, and these are all environmental effects that we are facing. Global climate change is probably the most important as far as potentially destabilizing our society and global society, but these others are very important as well because they're harming us now, they're harming our children, they're causing all sorts of effects that are detrimental to our existence. So this is on the environmental side. On the social side, we know that we have a situation in the United States of poverty in the midst of plenty. How can that be? How can the richest country in the world have poor people? How can we have a country that grows more food than it knows what to do with, and yet there are 40 million people that are considered to be food insecure by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. There are hundreds of millions that are hungry across the world, even though there is plentiful food on a global basis. Racism and oppression of women and indigenous peoples are prevalent throughout the world. Imperial wars and their residues are still a plague, with millions of lives lost to direct and indirect effects of these wars, which are still going on, of course, and the residues of wars that were fought years ago, such as the Vietnam War. At the same time, when we have these dramatic negative social and ecological effects of our society, at the same time, 8 people in the world own more wealth than half of the world's population. 8 people. You could drive them away in a van, SUV. Okay. What?
Stretch limo.
Stretch, yes, you could drive them away, stretch limo. Have more wealth than 3.2 billion people in the world. When we started working on this book, and it took about over 2.5 years to do it, it was, there were something like 44, or something like that, people in the world. And I said, well, what you need would be like a double-decker bus to drive these people away. By the time we finished it in January 2017, it was down to 8. So what are the main explanations given for all these problems that we have? They are all variations on a theme, I would say. And the theme is, one way or another, we're to blame. Okay? And I'll explain what I mean to that, what I I mean by that. But this is characterized by a pogonist who did a wonderful cartoon series on this anthropomorphic possum. And for the first Earth Day, he did this possum's name is Pogo. He's sitting on not a log, but on a tree, and he's saying, "We have met the enemy, and it is us." Okay? We are the enemy. We are, in other words, we are all to blame. Well, what is that? How does that come down in actual explanation? Well, some people say we're just a destructive animal. We are a species of animal that is just destructive. That's just the way we are. It's in our human nature, and that's all there is to it. We just destroy people. We're natural-born killers, and we don't give a damn about anything else except our own satisfaction. Or it's our psychology, our fondness for consuming more and more stuff. Somehow, innately, we have within us this desire to consume more and more stuff. You'd think if that's the case, if that really was true, why in the world would they spend $1 trillion a year in the United States to try to convince you to buy stuff? Okay? One way or another, that's what it is. Not only advertising, it's also product development and new changing the design of things, etc. I've heard this say, well, it's because we worship growth, we worship GDP, that the gross domestic product will grow and grow and grow. It's not. They don't think that maybe it's the other way around, which I'll get to in a second. Or another one is there are too many people in the world. There's just too damn many people, and that's the problem. That if we had fewer people, everything would be wonderful. And people who argue this, and I've had discussions with people like this, they basically want to have birth control for poor people, mostly in Africa. That's really their solution. Although they say we shouldn't, we should not have children, etc. as well. But it is not the poor people of the world that's the problem. If you could eliminate humanely the poorest 1 or 2 billion people in the world, it would have nothing. You would have no impact on the environment on a global basis whatsoever. If we could eliminate, on the other hand, the richest 5% or 10%, it would have a dramatic effect on the environment. That's because the wealthiest 10% of the people consume about 60 to 70% of all the stuff that is consumed in the world. So it's not an issue of too many people. Some people say, well, the problem is you're not buying the right stuff. If you only bought green stuff, everything would be good. So you should go to a producer or someone who's trying to sell you stuff, and they say that my product is green, mine's greener than theirs, and that would be fine. Okay. So it's your fault, but it's not. Okay. And the same argument is used with regard to poor people. It's their fault. Why is it their fault? It's their fault because if they had only gotten a better education, if only they had gotten married before they had a child, or whatever the explanation is, if only they had worked harder, then they would have gotten ahead. It's their fault. Okay? This absolves the economic and the political system, the social system, of any complicity whatsoever, and it helps to explain something that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote many years ago. The fact that so many civilized persons are willing to live in comfort, even if the price of this is poverty, ignorance, and disease in the majority of their fellow men. So this is one thing that keeps your conscience clean, semi-clean, is that you believe that it is not a systemic problem, it is their problem because they, the other, did something they shouldn't have done. If they had only done it better, everything would have been hunky-dory for them. Okay. Why is it my contention that capitalism is the problem? The problem in the social issues and the problem in the economic issues and the ecological issues as well. Well, what's the purpose of capitalism? It's not to provide the population with what we need for a good life. Rather, the purpose is to hire workers and provide tools and raw material in order to make a commodity or service for the purpose of selling it in a marketplace so it ends up with more, so the capitalist ends up with more money than it costs to produce it. There are other ways to make money too in the financial system. That's another story. Commodities are produced for sale, not for sale for profit, not to supply the public with their needs. If their needs are met, and if you're wealthy enough, your needs should be met, that's fine. If it's not, that's just the way it works out. That's the way the system functions. As Richard Levins, the late Richard Levins put it, agriculture is not about producing food, but about profit. Food is a side effect. Health service is a commodity. Health is a byproduct. Development is about investment opportunities and markets, not correcting decades of plunder and exploitation. And profits are stimulated by producing and selling more and more stuff. And as I mentioned, this has one of the aspects of capitalism, which is did not happen by accident, is to turn you and us into voracious consumers of all sorts of stuff. And if you don't have places to store the stuff, you should get a bigger house. Or now you can get the storage facilities they have that you can buy. That's one of the big growth areas, places where you can put your excess stuff for permanent or forever. You can export it to other countries. You can produce it in other countries because of low costs and easier access to foreign markets. But basically, the idea is you've got to keep producing more and more and more stuff. There is nothing built into the functioning of the system to take into account the social and environmental effects. It's an economic system that must grow, or else it's in crisis. When capitalism is growing at a very low rate, it's a crisis. If it's growing at a zero rate, it's a major crisis. Okay? So this is something that this fetishism that some people think that we have with growth, that there's something about GDP. If we measured something else like gross national happiness, then everything would be wonderful. But it's not what we measure. It's how the system operates. It needs to grow. Individual companies need to grow in order to compete with other like companies. They need to compete for market share, and they need to produce more next year and sell than they produced last year. So growth is built into the system. The system cannot function without this growth. And it is not a philosophy, it is part of the individual system. There's no way to rationally organize production to take into account the promotion of social and ecological health and well-being, or to prevent the degradation of the environment. This is what leads to what economists have called externalities. These are things that, these are these byproducts, if you will, or the side effects of this economic system. Poverty, racism, discrimination against women, all the various and sundry environmental problems, of which I've just touched on sort of an overview of what they are. These are byproducts of the system that are not necessarily meant to occur. Nobody necessarily planned them to occur. DuPont didn't plan originally to contaminate us all with PFOA, okay? But they did plan to develop chemicals, which they didn't test, and when they did test them and find out that they were toxic, they didn't tell anybody about it. Okay, so it's not surprising, by the way, something we have in the book here. About 1% of the population are considered to be sociopaths. When a study was made of the CEOs of corporations in the United States, it was found to be 20%.
Wow.
And of course, we have a psychopath and sociopath in chief in the country. Well, let me give you an example of how you can't take the environment into account when you make decisions. Here's an example of a person who was at a meeting that occurred in the City of London, which is, the financial district of London. And he said it's typical of those that happen every day in the City of London. So this is a quote. A group of Indonesian businessmen organized a lunch to raise £300 million to finance the clearing of a rainforest and the construction of a pulp paper plant. What struck me was how financial rationalism often overcomes common sense, that profit itself is a good thing, wherever the activity, whenever the occasion. What happens to the Indonesian rainforest was dependent upon financial decisions made over lunch that day. The financial benefits would come to institutions in London, Paris, and New York. Very little, if any, would go to the local people. The rainforest may be geographically located in the Far East, but financially it might as well be located in London Square Mile. So what is absolutely rational from an economic point of view in a capitalist system becomes completely irrational and destructive from a social and ecological point of view. What happens to the people who are living in the rainforest? What about the animals in the rainforest? What about the protection that the rainforests afford to the climate? And you know, it's just, it is just not, profits are the only thing that can be considered when you're making decisions in this type of a society. This is why there's no guarantee for everyone to have a job. Here we have a society in which you need to work in order to live a decent life, assuming you don't inherit a lot of money. But the society doesn't guarantee that you can have a job that pays sufficient wages that you can actually live a decent life. You know, most of the poor people in the United States are working poor. They're not non-working poor. So it's not just a question of having a job, which we're not guaranteed a job. We're not guaranteed a job at all, but we're also obviously not guaranteed a job at a living wage. It is clear that intractable ecological problems associated with capitalism can't be solved with an economic system that prays to the gods of profit and ever-increasing production. It is not a matter of choice. The quest for ever more profits is the essence of capitalism, its motivating and driving force. Social and ecological issues are intertwined and will only be solved together. Let me just enter a personal note, which is not discussed in the book. Last winter, my wife and I went with friends of ours to see a movie based on James Baldwin's work. The movie is I Am Not Your Negro. I don't know if it played here, if people were able to see it. It's based on writings that he had, an unfinished book that he was writing on Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And a portion of the documentary juxtaposes the violence of the 1950s and 60s with violence that was happening in more recent years, right after the police killings of unarmed African American men. And as I walked out of the theater, I was overwhelmed by the realization that it's something that I really knew, but I really didn't feel it quite this deeply, that there was no way to completely alleviate the situation of African Americans or solve the so-called racial question within capitalism. Economic and political equality would require a society dedicated to that end, willing to commit massive resources to rebuild neighborhoods with their schools and houses, provide equal access to quality education and medical care, and perhaps most important of all, to provide decent, good-paying jobs for all those needing them. Also required would be a concerted and prolonged educational program to combat the deep well of racism among whites in our society, which has become much more evident in the last year, but it was plenty evident before that. There is no way to resolve these huge social, ecological, and social ecological problems within a system based on private ownership and accumulation of profits. We are not going to reform our way out of this system, okay? And we can get into that later. These externalities, so-called, can't be reformed away because they're really part of the system. That's the way the system operates. It produces them. So is another system possible? And one of the arguments made is human nature is the problem. But our take is that human nature allows, very much allows, another system to be possible. We have within us a huge variety of characteristics or traits that are exhibited more strongly or less strongly. From the very best to the very worst. Starting from the worst, we kill, we torture other people. We have greed, selfishness, individualism, competitiveness, but we also have cooperation, reciprocity, empathy, altruism, and something that's exhibited in the youngest of children, the desire to be treated and to treat others fairly. That is something which actually is shown to be an innate trait, not just of humans, by the way, but also of other like species, like monkeys, and it's been shown with capuchin monkeys. It's an interesting story, but anyway. 95% of our time, probably more, as a species, we lived as hunter-gatherers. and some still exist today. In these societies, cooperation, reciprocity, sharing, egalitarian, equality between men and women was the norm. That is how they operated. That is what they needed in order to operate. What we have now in capitalism is suppression of those traits. Not that they disappear, but they are suppressed. And what's brought to the fore is individualism, selfishness, greed, competitiveness, acquisitiveness, that is acquisitive, to want things, patriarchal, inequality of opportunities, etc., that are all so essential to capitalism. For those of you who remember, there was a movie in the 1990s that Michael Douglas starred in called Wall Street. There have been other movies with Wall Street in the title since then. But Michael Douglas gets up in a meeting of shareholders of some corporation and he says, "Greed is good," and he goes on to explain what he means. And he's absolutely right. Greed is not only good, it's essential for the operation of capitalism. If you don't have greed, if you don't have the juices flowing within you to want more and more and to compete with that company over there and that company over there, you can't have a capitalist society. It just can't operate. So greed is essential. And we are taught from a very early age to be selfish. We're taught to be competitive. It starts in schools with soccer matches or whatever, with spelling bees, with all sorts of ways, compete for grades, etc. We're taught that competition is good, to compete with other people is good, instead of cooperation is good. So that the point is, we have within us characteristics which, if they are reinforced and brought to the fore, as they were for 95% of the time of our existence as a species, we can live in a very different society, one that is egalitarian and one that is ecologically sound. And our equality allows it. We have the way Stephen Jay Gould put it, the paleontologist and writer on evolution, human equality is a contingent fact of history. Equality is not given a priori. It is neither an ethical principle, though equal treatment may be, nor a statement about norms of social action. It just worked out that way. We are a very young species. There is very little genetic diversity within the species. There's more genetic diversity between different groups within Africa than between any of those groups and Europeans, people of European origin. There's no group that you can identify by their facial characteristics or by the color of their skin, which is more superior in any way to any other group. And this has to do with intelligence, it has to do with ethical, etc. And so this is just equality, as Stephen Jay Gould put it, is a contingent historical fact. Contingent, he means it didn't have to be that way. It could have worked out that we actually became different, enough different, that we were isolated for enough time for those types of differences to occur. But we're at best, well, it was said that we're 200,000 years old as a species. They say now it may be 300,000 years, but that is nothing from an evolutionary point of view. And we've been separated from each other for about 60 or 70,000 years at best, maybe 50, 40,000 years. So, which is not very much at all. So the genetic diversity is very, very tiny within the species. The way the biosphere functions allows it. We know a lot already about how to grow food, how to use renewable resources to produce power, capture thermal energy, use it to heat and cool homes, to store energy, renovate wastewater, design public transportation, etc., and how to do these things in environmentally sound ways. In nature, nothing takes place in isolation. Everything affects everything. This is a quote from Frederick Engels. Everything affects and is affected by every other thing. And it is mostly because of this manifold motion and interaction is forgotten that our natural scientists are prevented from gaining a clear insight into the simplest things. And I think this is true. This has set back science tremendously, not being able to see the connections, which ecology is actually a science which is helping to provide those study of those connections. Nature provides many natural strengths that allow ecosystems to function efficiently and be stable, to be productive, and to design farms and farming systems and landscapes that take advantage of the inherent strengths of natural systems, using minimal amounts of external inputs or interventions. And just let me give you one example of this. Many of the insects that feed on plants that we're growing for our own food have natural enemies. One type of natural enemy is actually will lay its eggs in the caterpillar that's feeding on your plant. And as those eggs develop, they will kill the caterpillar. So that's a natural control system. Well, the plant, when it's fed upon, sends out signals with gaseous compounds into the atmosphere. And if that beneficial is nearby, the specific beneficial that wants to feed on that specific insect, if it's nearby, it will come and do it. And it will lay its eggs, and it will kill the insect by doing that. So if you design a system, an agricultural system, where you have flowering plants that provide habitat for these beneficial organisms, they will be there when they're needed. Okay? If you have a sterile system of a monoculture, and you hit it with pesticides frequently, you're going to be killing the beneficials along with the target organisms, and you don't have habitat for beneficials in order for them to be there. Plants, by the way, have other defense mechanisms as well as calling in insects. They produce chemicals that slow feeding of insects. In other words, in response to being eaten upon, they will produce chemicals that give the insect indigestion, basically. They also will provide some sugary material at the wound site that a beneficial can use for sustenance. Okay, so there are things like this that go on in the world. So the question is, how do we learn about them and how do we take advantage of them? And how do we build healthy soils, which, as a soil scientist, this is I'm not saying this because I'm a soil scientist, but I can't claim this passionate view of it. It is at the heart of our agriculture. If we have healthy soils, you have healthy plants. If you have unhealthy soils, you have unhealthy plants that are not capable of defending themselves. They're harmed more easily by insects, and there's lots of, I give examples of that if anybody's interested in that. And we know how to build healthy soils. Organic matter is the heart of the story, and I'd be happy to get into that and provide you with material on it if you're interested. Okay, so socially and ecologically, there are terrible trends that are occurring in the world. However, we know that there is no particular reason. There's no stumbling block in our human nature. There's no stumbling block in our inequality, because there is no inequality. Men, women, different people from different born or derived, your ancestors came from different places in the world. And the way the ecosystem functions, all of those are sufficient, more than sufficient, to allow us to create a different type of society. So what type of society is needed? Let me quote from Martin Luther King. This is his speech on April 4th, 1967. "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." And it's a wonderful, that's a wonderful statement. In other words, we need a different economic, political, social system. In capitalism, we, the public, are at the service of the economy. We are the servants of the economy as workers, and then we have to go out and consume, right? And you've got to be a good consumer. Okay? If you're not a good consumer, that's bad for the economy, because the economy needs more and more stuff to be sold. But what we need is an economy and society organized to be at the service of humanity, supplying everyone with what they need to develop their full potential. At the same time, the economic, political, and social system must not have the compulsion for exponential growth but rather function to regenerate and maintain the health of the biosphere upon which we and other species depend. This allows people then to rationally regulate the human interactions with the rest of the biosphere as we go about providing all of us with what we need for a good life, or buen vivir in the Spanish phrase that Evo Morales has used. I don't think he coined it, the president of Bolivia, but in distinction from living better, he said, no, we shouldn't be talking about living better, we should be talking about living well. And we need to define this as a people. What does it mean to live well? And everyone should be able to have whatever they need, which is material and non-material things, substances, if you will, in order to live well. This means democratic social control of the economy and society, as opposed to private control for profit with its associated overbearing influence of capital on society, with workers controlling the workplace and planning together with the communities in which they occur. Resource use and allocation is therefore, it will become a social decision. Only democratic social control of the economy and resources we depend on offers the possibility, it doesn't assure it, but it offers the possibility of resolving the many social and environmental externalities of capitalism. This is what socialism is all about, or what is now many people call eco-socialism is all about. It allows us to live with substantive equality in harmony with the laws of nature in such ways that we hand it down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. That last phrase is from Marx, from Capital Volume 3. So basically our vision of a society, which we outline, is one of equality in decision-making, full participation, providing for a full life for all people, with a system of rights and responsibilities that would be enshrined by the system. As far as the economy goes, workers and communities would control the workplaces and the resources. There would be planning. You can't have a system like this without planning. Planning has got a it's almost like a swear word in some circles. But if you have a purpose for society, you have to have planning to the economy. All right? During World War II, there was a purpose in the United States to produce material for the war effort. There was a massive planning effort that occurred to allow this to happen. It also happened in World War I, by the way. You had to have certain parts had to be at certain plants at a certain time in order to produce an airplane to be able to ship it off to Europe to fight the war. If you have a social purpose, in that case it's war, but in this case it's something different. You need to have planning so that you have produced the right things in the right amount and have gotten them to the right places. The location of production. In general, we talk about this, that things should be produced as close as possible to where they're used, whether it's electricity or food. That's not possible with everything. I mean, it has to be taken with we need to do it within a rational boundary. Not every place is not every small town or city is going to produce railroad cars or going to produce buses or something like that. But what we can produce relatively easily and rationally nearby should be produced nearby. And we should also have rotation of workers, and by the way, this will go also for rotation of people in all areas of authority. Let me just talk about the workplace. This is a quote which comes from the book. It's from a farmer in a cooperative in Venezuela, a cooperative that was started long before Chavez by two liberation theology priests who escaped from Argentina, who were going to be killed by the military. And they started this cooperative. It's got 83 members. It's been operating since the 1980s at least. One of the 83 members, this is Omar Garcia, talks about how they want people to rotate into different responsibilities in the cooperative. He describes how the co-op operates, providing a glimpse of what's possible without bosses. Jobs are handled on a rotational basis agreed to by common consent. This extends to jobs that people don't want to do as well, and this is now Omar's words. Right now we have a fixed time, which is 2 months, in which each member takes on the accounting and administrative piece. We have had some difficulty with people who don't like doing the administrative piece. They say, I can't do it. I'm not going to take on this responsibility. But I think that every member has to take on this responsibility so there is transparency so that we are all equals. Garcia indicates that much has been learned from the failings that commonly occur in cooperatives. The problem with many, this is now a quote again from Omar Garcia, the problem with many cooperatives and organizations is when they leave the economic aspect to 2 or 3 people, they leave the economic management up to the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. This is what often causes problems. So we are breaking the scheme so that there is transparency and also so that we are learning as cooperative members, as farmers, and as producers. And I think that's just a wonderful statement. I mean, he's the sweetest guy. I've met him, and I found this separately. I had no connection with the time that I spent with him. But and I think this is also very important with regard to anything within society, in all positions of authority, that we need to have a system for rotation, easy recall, obviously, of officials, but also rotation of responsibilities. People staying in one position too long creates the possibility of problems of entrenched bureaucracies to develop. And that really is a downfall of an ecological society. Changing ethics and behavior patterns. These are things that don't happen by themselves. You could say, well, we're going to have a new society, therefore everybody's going to behave nicely to everybody else. It's not going to happen that way. This is from an Indian, Brabat Patnaik, about the caste system, but it holds with regard to all other issues of discrimination, I think, as well. We must not fall victim to the illusion that economic factors alone can overcome caste prejudice, caste consciousness, caste oppression. To believe this is tantamount to recreating the earlier illusion that capitalism would automatically overcome the old caste-based social structure. There has to be a conscious and direct assault on the inherited structure of social inequality, which calls for a socio-cultural revolution. In other words, we need to work on this. We need to work on it now, during the struggle for a new society, and even after a new society is created. It needs, this type of a struggle needs to go on. New patterns of living and working we need to overcome. I'm just going over some just titles of different sections, new patterns of living and work and leisure. We even have some designs in an earlier chapter. Neither of us are urban planners, but what you might think about if you were going to plan a new city, how it might be designed. I mean, I guess we have some gumption there, chutzpah or whatever you want to call it, to do things like that, but we need to rethink these types of issues. Environmental remediation and regeneration. This is a critical issue. There are so many polluted areas. They are now concentrated in certain parts of the country, concentrated in areas, of course, where poor people live, where is an example of our environmental racism, of course. One of the things also that a new ecological society, an egalitarian society, would want to do is to create priority for the nobodies. This is Eduardo Galeano's term, or the wretched of the earth in Frantz Fanon's language. That we need to deal as rapidly as possible with the people at the very bottom, the people living in hovels, the people who do not have enough food, who are not getting medical attention, who are really depressed and discriminated against. However, there are no guarantees that people in an eco-socialist society will make the right decisions. But this approach allows communities and workers to take the social and environmental issues into account as decisions are made and carried out. People will need to experiment, make mistakes, and correct those mistakes. I'm going to use a phrase that I've stolen part of from Margaret Thatcher, who's probably spinning in her grave as I say it. But if our goal is to heal the planet and its inhabitants in order to do away with the harmful social and environmental effects of capitalism, there is no alternative to socialism. It can't be done within capitalism. It's just out of the question. So, with that, I'll end. There are so many things I'd love to go into, including women's fashions, which we discussed how that gets imposed on women. I'll have to do this. I have to do this. I'm sorry. One of the things that we wrote about was how women were not allowed to wear pants, and of course, to wear high heels. And my co-authors didn't like it very much. A lot of the readers didn't like it very much. The editors didn't like it very much. And in January of this year, an editor looked at that and said, "Fred, this is all passé stuff." And because what I wrote about was that after the French Revolution, so this 1800, the French government passed a law against women wearing pants. Why? Because the revolutionary women of Paris, who were disgusted with the men not being revolutionary enough, marched to Versailles in pants. Therefore, obviously, it was the pants that did it, and you should outlaw the pants, right?
Right.
So, this, by the way, was on the books until 2013, actually. And you could get dispensation in France. You could get a dispensation if you're going to ride a bicycle or on a horse in horseback riding. Well, where pants came from, that's a whole other story, which is fascinating also.
There's a parallel with the history of the indigenous peoples.
But there's also in the United States, in the 1850s, there's a woman's journal in which a woman describes, it's a didactic piece, a woman describes how free she feels wearing this pants. But the professor says, but wait a second, pants breed agrarian radicalism and socialism. She says, what? If I knew that, I said, if I knew that wearing pants bred Fourierism, this, that, and that. I was using some other words. I'll never wear them again. And so, when I went to school, girls in high school weren't allowed to wear pants. Women weren't allowed to wear pants on the floor of the Senate up until my wife's telling me, move out here, Fred, get something. Until a couple of women senators marched onto the floor of the Senate in pants, and that was the end of that rule. But the whole idea of women wearing pants, making them more radical. One of the things I wanted to put in the book, which of course no one would let me do it, was if only it was true, But anyhow, so in January of this year, there was an article in the paper from, just as this argument, I was having this argument with the editor, in England, a woman went to work in last year, 2016, wearing flats to work. She was going to be working 9 hours in a temp job, and she was sent home because she wasn't wearing 2 to 4 inch heels. Okay. And then there was a study done in England in Britain about the rules for women for wearing clothes at work, etc. So I sent this to the editor. She said, "Fred, you're right. This belongs." And then we put in something about Trump, of course, and the way he feels about women. How they should dress. They should dress like women, of course. And it's just it is compared to other forms of oppression, it's almost ridiculous, but it's still an example of how deep some of these things are within us. Okay, anyway, I better quit. My wife's right. Anybody want to talk about what's good about capitalism? Go ahead.
Could you elaborate more on a term that I've heard recently, economic metabolism?
I'm not sure metabolism is being used now a lot. And Marx used the term, and John Bellamy Foster has, a monthly review, has used the term as our metabolic interaction with the rest of the world. Metabolism is like, all of the chemical, biological reactions that are going on inside us. And also that includes us intaking of air and breathing out of, CO2 enhanced air, taking the oxygen, eating of our metabolism. And Marx used the phrase in the way we interact with the environment, as a human interaction with the environment. And it's that uses of the word I'm familiar with. What's meant by the phrase itself, economic metabolism, I'm not sure. Yeah.
Overproduction in agriculture.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Canadian dairy farm quota system is something that would be useful in the U.S. for dairy farmers here?
There has been discussion about it, and my guess is that it doesn't have a chance in the world of being put into effect in the United States. There's even
do you see it working in Canada?
Well, it does work. I mean, there's no question. If you have a quota, what they did is they divided up the dairy market among the then existing farmers, and said you have the right to produce so much milk on your farm. That didn't talk about the number of cows. It's the amount of milk you produce, and you can't produce any more than that. If you do, you'll be penalized. So then what happens is then there's a market in these quotas. So if you want to get into dairy farming as a Canadian, you have to buy the quota from a dairy farmer. So it does. I mean, it keeps production more or less balanced with the needs, because if the need goes up, they can increase the quota. Or I don't know if they've sold new quotas based on increased population or use of milk and cheese and ice cream and things like that. So that, yes, I mean, it's an example of taking an irrational system and trying to put some rules and regulations in place that will make it more rational. But it's still, the American dairy farmers are saying, wait a second, we've got NAFTA, we want to be able to sell milk in Canada, and we want to be able to compete with the Canadians. So how that's going to work out, I don't know. But essentially, the system, I mean, I wrote an article, if anyone's interested, I can send it to you. It was in Monthly Review, which there's a copy of there. Don't take it, it's my issue, it's my copy. That irrational agriculture is incompatible with capitalism. And I wrote that as a background piece for someone who was writing a book. And then I said, well, why don't I just turn it into an article? And I tried to go through step by step why it is that all of these decisions that are absolutely rational from an economic point of view are completely irrational from a social or ecological point of view, and even sometimes from an economic point of view. In agriculture is a prime example where farmers, if the price goes up, they produce more. If the price goes down, they produce more. The chief economist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I was there, was astounded to hear this from farmers. He just didn't understand it. This is how farmers make decisions. And I was there with a number of dairy farmers, and this guy says, well, I have to. The price goes down, I have certain fixed costs. I have to produce more. I don't have an option. Which, of course, that drives
Then they dump it.
that drives the prices down even further, But it's just an example of some of the irrationalities in the system. One way to deal with that is a quota system. Yeah.
So I actually work at RPI at the engineering college, and I have a number of students who are really excited, interested in end of capitalism or socialism. I have libertarians turning into anarchists and liberals turning into socialists. It's amazing. But there's this kind of this contradiction that I'm trying to work out that I think you might be able to help me with. There seems to be a lot of excitement, not merely about the potential greed and enjoyment of capitalism, the hedonistic pleasure, but especially speed. The kind of socialist society, kind of ecological society you described, sounds like it operates on a time scale that is highly unlike the kinds of time scales that many people today not only experience, but they want. In a weird way, capitalism is not fast enough. Capitalism is not dense enough, even though in many ways what we've kind of outlined here would say we remove a kind of technological density from everyday life. So how do you sort of work out that sort of contradiction where we're, as a socialist myself, trying to sell folks or like trying to engage people in the idea of a radical new society when part of what they immediately desire, that society would destroy.
Well, I think it's a hell of an educational effort that's needed, I think, to do it. I know there are accelerationists, the people who say, yeah, we should just accelerate all these trends, but if you take a look in the book, I've got 2 pages with social and ecological trends, graphed with many, many different ones. It's some that are hard to read because there are lots of different graphs on each page, but it gives you the idea that after World War II, there has been an incredible acceleration in just about all of the negative trends that you can imagine. CO2 evolution, global warming, of course, pollution, the introduction of chemicals, of pesticides, whatever it is. And so the question is accelerating what? What are we accelerating? What is the purpose of production? What is the purpose of the economy? And what I maintain is an ecological society has to have as its purpose, its bottom line purpose, the satisfying of the needs of all people in the world. And I want to stress it again, that is material and non-material needs, and that includes a healthy, thriving environment with healthy, flows and cycles that are allowed to occur. So then the question is, what do we need for a good life? And that is a social decision that's going to have to be made by the people democratically. Not everyone's going to agree, but hopefully we can get some general agreement on it. And we need to be able to live within that. So that speeding up and doing things faster and faster should not be a goal. The goal, whatever we're doing, the question is, for what purpose are we doing it? And if the purpose isn't to enhance the well-being of humanity and the planet on which we depend, then we shouldn't be doing it. So I don't see anything to be gained from rushing to try to get new technology, new this, new that, new, iPhone 10, iPhone 20, iPhone 1000. What's the difference? Do we need it? I know people, there are going to be kids you talk to, you say, yeah, I need it. I got it because I'm going to be able to play my game faster or whatever it is. Okay, I understand. This is they're like addicts. In a way, it's an addiction. Like alcohol or drugs or whatever. It's an addiction, and I think that's how you have to approach it. I don't know how else to approach it. But the whole issue, to me, you got to keep bringing it back, is what do we want society to be like? What do we want the purpose of production to be? Production of anything to be. What is the purpose? And if it's to satisfy social needs as defined by the society, yes. If it doesn't, then I would say no. Yeah.
Are there countries that perhaps do have a model similar to that do put the needs, the social needs, before profit, capitalism? Are there any in existence, or are there any that maybe embody some of these qualities?
Well, this is the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution this year. There have been societies where there were attempts made to change from capitalism to a socialist society. Those got mainly derailed one way or another for a variety of reasons which we can go on about. Became highly bureaucratized. And they also did not fulfill what I consider to be, they did not do what I think needs to be done as far as turning over control of the workplace to the workers.
Right.
In other words, the workplaces themselves were also heavily bureaucratic, heavy with management. And a very heavy centralized plan. I'm talking about the Soviet Union now. So there are countries that have diverted and tried other things, like Cuba.
Right.
And Venezuela, by the way, with all its problems, one of the things that Chavez was trying to do was to transform a capitalist society into a socialist society in the midst of capitalism, without doing away with capitalism, which is a very tough act. And but they did many interesting things, and they continue to do it. They developed community councils. There are like 30,000 of them in Venezuela, where communities, this would be like 300-400 people in cities, were divided up into communities, and in rural areas, communities were developed, in which they were given the role of making decisions about what types of things they needed in their communities, what type of infrastructure, And this is, of course, it was with oil money that it happened, but communities built schools, they built roads, they built clinics. One community I visited, the women were just disgusted. They didn't have running water, even though there was a water main that ran about 1 kilometer away. And they got the expertise and the material, and they provided the labor to bring the water to the community and to hook it up to the houses. So that this was, the dramatic drop in the poverty in Venezuela was an example of putting emphasis on the nobodies. They built under Maduro, after Chavez, they built something like 1 million apartment units that are supposed to be reasonable quality apartment units for people from the slums. So it's an example of trying to do things, but they had problems of their own. They had corruption, which is not unknown in Latin America, not unknown in the United States of America. Was that? Yeah. And they had a capitalist class that was very much opposed to what they were trying to do and was sabotaging and has continued to sabotage them. And they've made their own mistakes as well. Other mistakes I'm talking about. For example, when they took over factories, they did not necessarily put them in the hands of the workers, but appointed government people to be the head of the factories. So that there's good and bad, and I think the same thing's happening in Bolivia. There's good with the bad that's happening, but they're trying different ways. They're trying some different techniques. And I think the community councils is the way to go, is that we need to have the local people making decisions about what happens in their area. And then you have to have some structure, which they were calling communes, comunas in Venezuela, which would be groups of community councils. And then you have to have some way for them to make decisions and then group up above that. Because not everything happens at the community level. So and those were being run democratically, completely. They elected their own people. One person was in charge of the budget, another person took charge of electrical problems in the town, another person took charge of whatever. They just divided up issues in the town. In their community. So I would say no, there's no place that's doing this, but there are places that are experimenting. And in the Venezuelan Constitution, there is a statement of a devotion to eco-socialism. And there are eco-socialists in Venezuela that are fighting right now and trying to bring that about. It's a very, very tough act to pull off, no question about it. I think societal change is something which is extremely difficult to do, period, no matter how you do it. Whether you take over a whole country by armed force or you take over by vote, it is extremely difficult. Yeah.
Well, I just want to see if you heard it. You probably have. There is some small country. There's an article in the New York Times several years back that talks about a gross national happiness.
Yeah.
Which country is that? Bhutan?
Yeah, Bhutan.
Yeah. I don't know what they're doing about it. But.
Yeah, it's fine. I've got no objection to measuring, gross national happiness. But in capitalism, it doesn't have much meaning. If you find that people aren't that happy, well, what do you do about it?
Make more stuff.
Like people living in Appalachia or people living in poor areas in Baltimore or wherever it is, what are you going to do about it? And they're the same issues, by the way. They're the same issues. And people react the same way, just, the same problems, the same hopelessness that you find in some of the inner city neighborhoods minority neighborhoods you find in Appalachia, in the white former coal mining areas. So this is, so what are you gonna do? So they're not happy. You know, well, what you need is a plan. You need a society that says, these people deserve to be happy, and we're gonna do everything we can, you know, to change that. And we have to have jobs, we have to have something for them to do, we have to, you know, help. It's, yeah.
I just have a lot of trouble imagining how these shoulds of our society is ever gonna happen. You keep saying we should have these social changes, we should have the wellness of people at heart, we should have these ways of reforming our social systems. It's gonna come from social systems, and you yourself, you know, say it's very hard. I don't understand how we're gonna get there. And the piece that's missing for me are the ecological realities that people can't wrap their heads around. The needs for water, for food, for means of production that include appropriate recycling of resources. You know, these are scientific realities. The speed of capitalism and whatever we were talking about before, you know, doesn't work on that same time scale. And so I just get kind of hopeless that these fundamental realities that govern our life on this earth are going to win the day. When you can have people with their communes and doing that and working from the ground up, it sounds like it's always from the ground up. But when you point out that 8 people in the world who can fit into a minivan control more than half of the wealth in the world, they're going to control the social systems too. So you see my problem.
Yeah, well, what has to happen is a revolution. You need,
Yes.
the people need to take control
Yes.
of the society. I'm not talking about communes. You know, I mean, going out like in Vermont, people did in the 1970s. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm nothing opposed to that.
No.
But we're talking about a revolution at national and international levels.
Organizing.
And this means organizing. This means, one of the
Yes.
things that this means, and we get into this in the last chapter, is that there are a lot of people in the United States who are progressive one way or another. And they're working on a variety of issues, all of which are terribly important. Okay? This goes from anti-racism to women's rights, to the environmental, the various environmental issues, not just one. You know, people involved in climate change, people involved in, you know, pollution with chemicals, people involved in all these various and sundry NGOs. There must be literally thousands of them in the United States. Each of these issues is not going to be really resolved in this system. And what we need to do is to start talking to each other and saying to each other, your issue is my issue, and my issue needs to be your issue, and we need to work together. And this needs to be done in some sort of a arrangement, whether it's a coalition or whether it's a party which eventually gets formed, in which people are all these various groups are absorbed into it. But you saw that, probably some people here were at the climate change march in New York in September 2014. It was wonderful. There were lots of different groups from all different walks of life involved in that climate change march. But what happened was, everybody went home.
Right, yes.
It was never meant to hold together. It was never meant to start a movement of bringing groups together. And what's needed, what?
It was meant to start a movement.
Well, maybe it was meant to start a movement,
No,
but
but
they
it
didn't
didn't.
follow up. Nobody followed up. It was just dissipated, all that energy dissipated. And what we need is, what Jane McAlevey calls deep organizing, you know, the union organizer. You know what I'm talking about? Deep organizing.
Yes, yes.
Need to be organizing in the communities, need to be talking to them about all these issues, finding out what's on their minds, what's on people's minds. This is a tough job. It's the type of organizing that used to happen in the unions in the 1930s and 1940s. And it needs to happen not just around union issues, but around ecological issues, around racism, around everything. And so this is not a trivial task. This is a major task. But my point is that, yes, there's tremendous power that's on the other side. But we have tremendous power too, if we can get organized. And the question is getting people together. Because if you're in favor of social justice, you're in favor of all social justice. You should be, and you should be in favor of ecological justice because that's related to social justice. All these issues are related. Somebody's had their hand up over here very patiently while I've been talking.
So I'm totally down with your conclusion that climate change is sort of a byproduct of capitalism, and to me, sort of the ideal that saying that it's either capitalism or socialism sort of like stops, or like it doesn't allow us to imagine different types of political economies that could work. And so I'm wondering if you have thought through other alternative political economies. One that I'm thinking about recently is called the Pluralist Commonwealth, put together by Gar Alperovitz. Basically a series of cooperatively owned firms in which there's sort of like a communal system of representatives from each firm that come together and plan market exchanges. And there are sort of like arguments that something like that would be easier to transfer from capitalism to than something like socialism. So I'm just wondering if you see it in these sort of binaries where it's like it's either this, or if you yourself are also maybe grappling with other ways of thinking about political economies.
Well, I think we need to be thinking broadly, and we need to be experimenting broadly on different ways of organizing ourselves and different ways of relating to one another in the economy and socially as well. The problem that I see with that, and by the way, no, I think we should. I think the main thing is we need to talk about what can we do differently that we can overcome these so-called externalities, which I don't like that term, but I keep using it. But anyhow, these very negative side effects of capitalism. Mm-hmm. How would it be organized? How would we do it? And we need to think it through, and we need to start talking about it. And this book is just thrown out there as an example of our thinking and how we got there, sort of along the way. The problem with worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain or others that operate along these lines is that you are functioning within a capitalist society. And if you're functioning within a capitalist society, you have to be in competition with other people, with other companies. I mean, that's how it works. Now, if you're going to say, well, eventually we're going to take over company by company, we're going to take over the whole economy, somehow the workers are going to buy it out from the capitalists, I don't think that's ever going to happen. I remember people talking about that in Argentina in the 1960s and 1970s. Right. And they were going to take over all of Argentina company by company. And it never got very far. You know, it just, it's also, to a certain extent, I think what happens, worker-controlled companies in the United States are good. I'm not opposed to them in any sense, and I think we should promote them and we should patronize them. Okay? If we need to, patronize whatever they are making or selling. But that's not the answer, because that worker-controlled company has got to be in competition either with another worker-controlled company over here or a capitalist company.
The idea would be that there would be representatives from each one in a planning process together. So the end goal of this sort of like communal committees would be for worker-owned cooperatives that would, in a capitalist system, compete to instead think about how they can manage market exchanges in a way that is equitable and not driven by competition.
If you got to the point where you could have 90% of the economy that way, you might be able to pull something like that off. How do you get there? And my feeling, this is a gut feeling on my part, is that you can't get there from here. That's just, and the reason behind it, time, enough's enough. It's, I can't prove it. There's nothing I can say, well, A plus B equals C or something, and prove something to you about that. But what happens is, and I've seen this with cooperatives, agricultural cooperatives, this is what Omar in a way talked about also, is they become, they are in competition with commercial companies that are not cooperatives. And they have to bid in the same way that they do. They have to undersell them. They have to, in essence, exploit their workers in the same way that these others do. So that I think that that is the problem. That within a it's the same thing as trying to build what Chavez was trying to do in Venezuela, trying to build a socialist society within a capitalist society. Here you're trying to build a cooperative society, if you will, within a capitalist society. But you have all the other pressures of the society coming in on you, and you have to work against that. And I don't think it can be pulled off. I don't think Mondragon is going to be grow and grow and grow and take over Europe. It's a wonderful example of what can be done in Spain. But they also have plants in other countries where they hire workers. So here's a cooperative. They operate very nicely, and they do a really good job among the many companies that are part of it. But they also operate companies in which they hire labor because they have to produce at a certain price for a certain market in order to sell. So they're sort of the contradictions of capitalism come back to haunt them, and it's very hard to get out of that. So it's something I can't prove. But no, I think the issue to me is social control. That is control by people instead of private individuals.
Right.
Whether it's through some system that can come into being of cooperatives, or socialism, which to me is basically the same thing, where the workplace is controlled by the workers. What is that if not a cooperative? So that anyhow, these are definitely issues that need to be talked about.